Okay, well, welcome back to the next session in our symposium today, In the Hold, Decolonising Cook in Art, Text and Performance. And for those of you who've tuned in for this panel but missed the previous one, I want to acknowledge that we're on beautiful Kaurna land and to acknowledge custodians and traditional owners. Kaurna land's sovereignty's never ceded. So this panel is titled Curating Cook, and really our intention in this session was to bring together groups of curators who had done some recent cook exhibitions, including, of course, Ali Baker and Fiona Salmon, whom I'll introduce in a minute. But we've got as guests zooming in from Tasmania, Greg Lehman and Rachel Rose. And they curated an exhibition very recently at the Plimsoll Gallery at the University of Tasmania titled Too Many Cooks. So we're going to look at the respective cook exhibitions, Too Many Cooks and In the Hold, and we're going to ask the curators to reflect on their approaches to charting multiple cook narratives in visual culture and how they've foregrounded their creative responses to narratives of history, time, possession and dispossession. And we have a wonderful facilitator, Katrina Schlunker. So I'm going to introduce them one by one and then they can come and sit with us and we'll see Greg and Rachel on the screen. So Greg Lehman is a professor, he's an art historian and he's recently been appointed as the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Leadership at the University of Tasmania. He is known as a curator and most recently he created the wonderful The National Picture, Art of Tasmania's Black War, which was shown at the National Gallery of Art in Canberra and at Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and he did that with curator Tim Bonahady. And Greg, we know each other. Greg's hi from Adelaide. Greg's a descendant of the Trawulaway people of northeast Tasmania, and he also writes extensively on colonial history and the visual representations of Aboriginal people. Rachel Rose is the registrar and keeper of University of Tasmania's Fine Art Collection, and she also maintains her own practice from her private studio, and she, as I mentioned, was the co-curator with Greg of Too Many Cooks. And then closer to home we have Ali Baker, who is a co-curator of In the Hold with Fiona Salmon, and she's a member of our wonderful Unbound Collective. She's a Mirning woman from the west coast of South Australia, a multidisciplinary artist and educator. And her work is very much concerned with the colonial archive, with memory, intergenerational transmission of knowledge, and this informs her work both as an academic and as an independent artist and member of Unbound. And Fiona is, as you know, the director of Flinders University Gallery and Museum, and she spends extended time with Aboriginal communities in Arnhem Land, and she also has qualifications in museum studies from Deakin University. And then finally to Katrina Schlunker, who's our facilitator. She's a very well-known scholar of Australian studies and cultural studies, and she's written quite a lot over the years about cook. And she researches and writes also in material cultures, Indigenous art and colonial Australia, and she is an adjunct associate professor at University of Tasmania. So I'll invite the panel members to come and sit down and we'll speak. I'll hand over to Katrina. Thank you.
So I guess that means we're going first, Ali.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm not sure if people can see us or they can see... Oh, yes, here we are.
Here we are.
I want to thank Fiona Foley for the incredible lecture and film that we've just watched. And I want to honour all the Aboriginal people and Indigenous peoples globally who might be tuning in today. So my name's Ali Baker, and Fiona and I are going to talk a little bit about the exhibition that we co-curated in the Hold. And I just want to acknowledge that the title for the exhibition in the Hold is really honouring Christina Sharp's work, a book that she wrote, which we all read, the Unbound Women all read, called In the Wake, on Blackness and Being. And in that book, she talks about this kind of idea of the wake and the hold of ships and slave ships. But I guess it's also about the relationship, the precarious hold and that we have with each other. And Fiona talked a little bit about this idea of us witnessing and returning the gaze. So we are in a hold, in a relationship, and how that relationship is articulated, how it plays out in national narratives are really important conversations for universities. And as academic artists situated within universities, and I know the other academic artists will talk about their show within the university, these complex conversations are really important. What we hold for our memory, what we hold and keep for the future, and how we continue to honour the ancestors, our ancestors who warrior people fought long and hard and continue to fight to not be written out of the national narrative. And yeah, maybe Fiona, you want to talk?
Thanks, Ali. So we in talking about our show, we've prepared just a few slides. And hello to our colleagues in Tasmania, Greg and Rachel. We can see you on screen. Nice to see you there and to have you with us. So we will flick through our slides and just give you a bit of an introduction really to the project that we undertook together. Of course, like, the many Cook exhibitions that have taken place this year, it came very much in response to, the federal government's commitment, if you like, to fanfare and celebrations that Ali mentioned earlier in the day. And I suppose it really was an opportunity, the exhibition was an opportunity to speak back to that and to take the discussion perhaps in a slightly different direction. So, just a few install shots maybe of the show. The gallery at Flinders is a fairly oblong in shape, about 17, 18 metres long, about 8 metres wide. And so the space is open and we have hung it, I suppose in parts in a bit of a salon hang, and drawing essentially from the collection of Flinders University Museum of Art, but also we brought in a few loans, one of which you can see in the centre of this image from the Art Gallery of South Australia, the work by Vincent Namatjira, which we'll come to later. Just to give you a sense of the layout, I'll just walk through these. The Gordon Bennett there, the hang, and then a long shot towards the other end of the space with Julie Goff's work at the end, and we're delighted that Julie will be speaking later to that work. We're also delighted that Darren Sievers will be speaking, whose work is represented in our show, and Ali, of course, will be speaking later again as part of the Unbound Collective to their work, Tallship work, which is screened. So we won't talk to those works particularly in this presentation, but just focus on a handful of others, particularly the works which represent Cook himself. So perhaps this one, we'll start with this one. Sandra Saunders is a Ngarrindjeri woman who is known as, quite an activist, highly regarded activist who's fought long and hard for Aboriginal rights in South Australia. She was a huge voice in the protests against the building of the Hindmarsh Bridge, and has been actively painting stories of protest for a number of years. This for me, this work really, I suppose, encapsulates that idea of the Eurocentric narrative, and I suppose the simplicity of it in the way in which we've been taught at schools over generations in this country. So, for instance, we see the Endeavour, the boat, arriving to what appears to be a fairly empty land. We see Cook planting the flag to take possession of the country. And then, of course, we see the portrait of Cook in profile, venerating the hero and, I suppose, celebrating his work to conquer, I suppose, the country and to claim sovereignty for the King of Britain. What I like about Sandra's work is that she uses found objects in her making. She will often repurpose things that she has found in op shops or elsewhere. And this gives the work a kind of a flimsiness and a ready-made kind of feel. And to me, that in a way speaks to the flimsiness of that narrative that we've been told, to the fact that it is thin, that it is shabby in a sense, and that it is ripe for reinterpretation, for a retelling.
So in this work, you can also see that idea of the dimensionality of a particularly polarised view of a kind of settlement, invasion, and how she describes these sets of ideas and how they are delivered and rehashed in school books and textbooks in the contemporary, and it's really often, I think we had some talk about national curriculum, but it's very much reliant on individual teachers and schools to actually develop particular and deliver those thoughtful histories that are complex and intertwined entanglements to children so that they can understand something beyond a two-dimensional view.
Yeah.
And Sandra is an incredible activist. I just want to acknowledge her incredible, and the work that she did in relation to the Hindmarsh Island Bridge and ALRM, and the continued work that she exhibits in Tarnanthi. There's some incredible films about Sandra's work, and I want to give a big shout out to Deadly Woman. Yeah.
So I've moved on, Ali. So now, of course, we're on to Christian Thompson's work. This work is very well known and has been, I suppose, reproduced quite a lot this year particularly. We were very fortunate to be able to acquire this a couple of years ago into the collection, and it's been an amazing teaching tool for us here. Of course, this is part of Christian's Museum of Others series, which was made while he was undertaking a PhD at Oxford University, and was also very interested in the Pitt Rivers Museum and its holding of cultural collections, ethnographic collections, and other cultural material. 2 minutes. Oh, is that 2 minutes? Oh my goodness, we've gone very quickly. Okay, so we hung this work, for example, with some historic pieces, that were in the collection. Ali, I know that you wanted to speak a little bit about these historical works that we have. Christian's work, of course, called The Museums of Others, is speaking back to these very works of the made during the so-called Enlightenment, which cast Aboriginal people very much as a primitive race, and I suppose at a low rung in that sort of hierarchy that was circulating at that time. There's this one in particular as well.
So we have some historical etchings in the show, and I want to acknowledge, I guess, the importance of what Fiona Foley was talking about in relation to eugenics, ideas of social Darwinism, and the construction of race in the ranking and hierarchy of Aboriginal people, and how, also the important work of Aileen Morton-Robinson, who talks about this idea of our bodies being seen as possessions, as part of a possessive kind of culture, as part of a collecting culture, which is, the origins of museums and galleries has to acknowledge that kind of possession of our bodies at the very basis, and I think Christian's work does that in terms of possessing bones, and the Pitt Rivers has just recently agreed in 2020 to bring down the human remains that it had on display. So it's taken that long to for our old people as bodies to be. So when we see things like this, which is a bush scene in the South Australian Court of an expo in Melbourne, you have to kind of understand your history to know that we were forming living and non-living displays of an example of the primitive. And this idea of Cook bringing civilization becomes, I guess, the kind of key, important, polarising conversation that's still continuing in this country about the legitimacy of an invasion, the legality in current international human rights or international law, how sovereignty is understood in relation to those acts of possession, what is settlement, and for me, unless you have an understanding of eugenics and social Darwinism, you can't really tease out those threads of history into the present, and they're playing out in the present. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of the
Okay,
time.
we've got to hand over to our dear colleagues. Hello.
We'll flick through. So a very important work by Gordon Bennett. This was made very shortly after he graduated from art school, made in 1989, just the year after of course, the bicentennial year of 1988, which was I suppose, a catalyst for what has become known as the culture wars. I won't say a lot about the work, other than it's the same image of Cook, of course, that we see in this work that we saw in Christian Thompson's, and then also this work again that we see in Chips McAnulty's work, which makes a link, of course, between the current pandemic, COVID-19, and the other pandemics that were brought in by the white invaders with the arrival of the First Fleet, notably smallpox. Ali, did you want to say anything more? We'll just jump through.
Just to acknowledge that the work by Gordon Bennett, 1989. So these conversations have been going on, and we talk about this a continual kind of. There was a discussion about amnesia, this idea of being written out, and the importance of those messages to continue into the present. And Chip's work has already raised a lot of controversy in relation to today's event. And I think, in a sense, as a non-Indigenous person speaking about the kind of the reality, the reality of the perspectives in relation to ideas of pandemics and disease, and the impact of smallpox which reached South Australia. And, you know, we were told a story by a Gadigal elder in relation to, you know, the stories that came along the river and the fact that that disease had kind of reached parts of South Australia before it was colonised officially, means that, you know, for us, for our communities, yeah, there has been an enormous amount of pandemics that have occurred here, you know, the impact of that.
And now perhaps we'll just end with this one. This, of course, is the loan we mentioned earlier from the Art Gallery of South Australia. It's actually a double-sided portrait, if you like. On the one side, it's a self-portrait by the artist Vincent Namatjira. On the other side, of course, it's Cook again, a bit more dishevelled, I think, than the earlier versions that we're familiar with, a bit rumpled when you see him in the flesh. And I think, Ali, you made a great comment when you were talking about this work before, in that it just feels very prop-like. It feels like it's a prop to that historical narrative in a way when we look at that side with Cook. But then, of course, when we look at the other side of the artist, and there's a great deal of humour in the way in which the artist has represented himself, I think that speaks also back to Fiona's talk in a way where she talks about beauty as a way to seduce the viewer. We can also think about humour in art as a way to sort of draw people in and to engage them in the work. And Vincent's very candid when he's spoken about this work and the humour in it, and making the point that, of course, it's two sides of the same coin, and depending where you stand when you're looking at this sculpture depends on how you view history.
Yeah, and how you position yourself in relation to that history, because I think we can all change our relationship with our histories and the kind of positioning of how we understand those two-dimensional perspectives, those polarising perspectives, is a really important conversation that needs to continue to be fought for.
Excellent. Okay, on that note, I think we should hand over to Tasmania. Sorry if we've gone over time, but over to you. Do we need to flip the slides over? Great. Thank you, Rachel and Greg.
Hi, everyone. Oh, that's great. I can hear myself coming back. Ugh. I'm not sure if the text can do anything about that.
You sound good to us.
Yeah, I'm getting my voice is coming back in with about a 1 second delay. Oh, it just stopped. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Greg. It's sounding good.
Oh, great. That echo has stopped now. Thank you. Oh, great IT God. Thanks very much for the invitation to participate. We'll just hop straight into it. Rachel and I are going to give you just a quick introduction to the themes that we built this exhibition around, and you'll see some of the works, a bit of a peek into the hang itself, and then I'll finish up by just briefly talking about some art historical research that was also an interesting result of this exhibition. So, Rachel.
In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook made the first of 3 voyages to the Pacific. Appearing to be a scientific expedition, in reality, Cook carried secret instructions to find and make detailed charts and observations of the great southern continent. He was directed by the Admiralty to cultivate a friendship and alliance with the natives, making them presents of such trifles as they may value. Despite instructions to obtain consent from Indigenous people, he took possession of the entire east coast of Australia, as if the country was uninhabited. The concept of terra nullius, empty land, was born. This was the beginning of a disregard for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that continues 250 years later. Too Many Cooks examines the consequences of Cook's expeditions for Indigenous people in Australia by bringing together a unique exhibition of works from the University of Tasmania's Fine Art Collection. The Aboriginal and other artists represented draw attention to the impacts of British invasion and expose a conflicted account of European discovery and settlement of Australia, focusing a critical gaze on our national story. This exhibition also celebrates the strength and beauty of Indigenous culture in Australia that has been the foundation of survival since British invasion.
While Cook's 1770 voyage did not include a visit to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania as it's now known, we are nevertheless a critical part of the story of Cook in Australia. In April 1770, the navigator sailed from New Zealand with the intention of landing on the east coast of Van Diemen's Land. However, the so-called Great Navigator completely missed the coastline that had been mapped by Abel Tasman 130 years before, and instead made landfall off the coast of Gippsland. Cook finally found Van Diemen's Land on his third voyage, 7 years later. His official artist, John Webber, made several important drawings, resulting in the publication of the first known engravings of Tasmanian Aboriginal people.
Life worlds. Over a period of at least 60,000 years, Indigenous people occupied almost every part of the continent now known as Australia. Yet despite instructions issued by the British Admiralty, no recognition of the inherent rights of the hundreds of First Nations of Australia were made by Cook or any of the colonial governors who followed in his wake. Intimate knowledge of climate, biodiversity, landscape, law and history has been woven together across 2,000 generations of stories, ceremonies and songlines to celebrate the intricacy and wisdom of a diversity of Indigenous life worlds that bound people to their country. Blind to the beauty of these cultures, British imperialism instead imagined an empty land, terra nullius, that could be available for the taking. It was not until 1996 that the Wik people of Cape York won landmark legal recognition in the Australian High Court that their native title rights could coexist with British property law. Significantly, it was on Cape York that Cook made the first claim over Aboriginal territory on behalf of the British Crown. Throughout this tumultuous period, and since time began for First Nations across the continent, ancestral traditions of visual culture continue to celebrate rich connections to country through unique painting and sculpture.
Tragically, the defining experience of Indigenous people in Australia since Cook's arrival has been displacement from their country by settlers. In many regions, this involved what many scholars describe as ethnic cleansing or genocide, processes which deeply challenge popular conceptions of a continent peacefully settled. Official narratives avoided such descriptions by substituting suggestions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were inherently inferior to British society, arguing that their extinction was inevitable. Alongside of direct impacts on Indigenous populations, colonial histories overwrote 60 millennia of knowledge, stories and ceremonies with a memoir of imperial pride, nationalism and scientific racism. A popular desire for Aborigines to eventually disappear accompanied the redefinition of ancient cultural landscapes as resources awaiting exploitation and development. Colonial artists, often under direct instruction by military commanders, crafted a visual rhetoric that communicated peaceful, picturesque opportunities for new settlers and the success of colonial enterprise. In Van Diemen's Land, this involved the visual exclusion of Aboriginal people from colonial landscapes until the Black War was over. Then, from the early 1830s, Aboriginal people were reinscribed in colonial landscapes as a melancholic testament to colonial achievement. Many contemporary Australian artists seek to interrogate the rhetoric of colonial art by refiguring picturesque landscape scenes, exposing the processes at play in our visual history, documenting the impact not only of invasion by settlers, but also but also introduced species and environmental destruction.
In 1988, Australia celebrated the bicentennial of the arrival of Governor Arthur Phillip's first fleet of British colonists. This celebration echoed earlier commemorations of Cook's visit and similarly struggled to situate the First Nations of Australia, who still consider these British heroes as invaders. Such celebrations have little scope to acknowledge the intergenerational legacies of genocide, exile, and injustice that were consequences of their arrival. The bicentennial was met with some of the largest public protests ever seen, as sympathetic Australians from all walks of life marched alongside the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander comrades to demand an honest account of history. As part of this response, artists from Indigenous, colonial, and migrant origins created a series of screen-printed posters titled Right Here, Right Now, 1988, seeking to capture a moment in Australian history that forever changed our national view of the past and our relationship with the future. Right Here, Right Now, 1988 was arranged by Co-Media Adelaide. The series toured nationally to 10 galleries, including the University of Tasmania. Themes of land rights, deaths in custody, and dispossession mounted a strong rejection of the official message of celebration, while powerfully acknowledging the survival of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and continuing demands for justice.
The sanctity of country as a repository of knowledge, history, and spirituality forms an essential common thread for Indigenous people across Australia. Walking on country, learning from country, and sharing stories through creative practice locates artists in the place of their ancestors and renews continuity of culture that has been a foundation of survival during times of disruption and denial. Making art that respects and seeks justice for country is an undeniable refutation of Cook's presumption of terra nullius. More than this, it is an act of deep remembrance of landscape as an archive of knowledge and a place of personal meaning.
The entire coastline of Eastern Australia was visited by Cook during his first and third voyages, from tropical Possession Island off the tip of Cape York to the temperate grandeur of Bruny Island in the far south. Like those numerous other Dutch, British and French navigators, these were journeys popularly celebrated as testament to European accomplishment and superiority over Indigenous peoples. Yet Indigenous peoples of Australia also made their way to the island continent by sea travel over 2,000 generations ago, following epic migrations across multiple continents. European visual art and literature are replete with celebration of the glory of maritime culture. This usually ignores the ugly reality that sailing ships were instruments of colonial power and the insidious trade in slaves that enabled the spectacular growth of Western colonial economies. The Indigenous canoes of Eastern Australia were a common subject for European expedition artists. However, their ethnographic perspective ensured that these depictions mostly served as evidence of the primitivism of First Nations technology. Through different eyes, the Palawa canoes of Tasmania can be recognised as objects of elegance and beauty.
The artist John Webber accompanied Cook on his third voyage, creating the first European images of Tasmanian Aboriginal people with a sensitive portrait of a Nyunene man from Bruny Island, which was reworked as the engraving. He also produced a portrait of Cook before embarking on this voyage. Both of these characters appear in an unfinished drawing of Cook's meeting with Aboriginal people on Bruny Island. This drawing seems to have been superseded by a later work of Webber's, depicting the historic moment of Cook's death in Hawaii. Both images share compositional similarities, but describe vastly different scenes. On Bruny Island, Cook presents a medal to a Nyunene man, attempting to create a relationship between Aboriginal people and the British Empire that would soon result in dispossession and genocide. In Hawaii, Cook's disingenuous diplomacy backfires when he is killed by Hawaiians protecting their king from Cook's attempt to take him hostage. I've been working with this unfinished drawing and Webber's later Death of Cook for some years now, and I've come to the conclusion that there's a a more than uncanny link between these two images. And I think that the unfinished drawing of Cook's meeting at Bruny Island in Tasmania was actually used as a study for the development of Webber's Death of Cook. We can see some interesting compositional relationships in both images. Cook has the same awkward forward stance with an outstretched arm. There are grouped figures both in front and behind
Greg,
Cook.
sorry, Greg, I'm just jumping in. We actually can't see the images on the screen. Are we meant to be moving them forward here?
Oh.
I think you need to move them forward.
Have
at
you
your
lost my-
end. We're still on the opening slide. There we are. We can see that now.
That's interesting.
Okay. I think you've got that in your
Can
control.
you see anything now?
We can see the two works side by side.
Can you see anything now?
Just 1 second.
Hello?
Can you just come?
What's happened?
Okay, so if you want the slide, we can move the slides forward here at this end, Greg. You just indicate to us
I
when you want
can't
us
hear
to move
anybody.
the
Something's
slide.
happened.
Greg, can you hear me?
I've lost. Oh,
Okay, can you hear us now?
yes, I can hear
Okay,
you now.
sorry, Greg. Sorry, we can see the images now up on this
Great.
end. So if you want to just signal to us, we can move them along at this end. Just signal when you'd like to move it forward. And we've just got
Okay.
another 5 minutes, just letting you know.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So, what are you seeing right now?
We can see the compositional relationships between the two illustrations.
This is tricky. Do you have red circles?
No, there's no. We don't see the red circles. Now we do.
Okay, can you advance?
We do now.
Okay, so you can see the two figures of Cook have this very, very similar awkward forward stance with outstretched arm. If you go to the next slide, please. And there are two, in both of the images, there are grouped figures both in front of and behind Cook. And then the next slide, please. We see a small boat positioned in a very similar place in the composition, just offshore. And most significantly for me, these two compositions say something very different in that Cook is approaching the Nyunene man face to face and appears in this composition to be very much a figure in control of the situation, whereas in Webber's refiguring of the composition for the death of Cook, he's approached from behind, and so the role, both the role of Cook and the role of the Indigenous person in the drama are switched, and Cook all of a sudden becomes a victim of treachery, and the Indigenous person is no longer placed in an equal footing with him. If we go to the next slide, the other thing that I'm speculating about with the death of Cook is that the sketch of the Nyunene man that was used for the Bruny Island sketch, and you can see that he's repeated in the faces of the two men standing next to Cook on the left, seems to have also been used by Webber as a face for all of the Hawaiian men in the death of Cook. So in conclusion, and just wrapping up, and we can talk about this a little bit more in discussion if people are interested. This is an archive that not only offers us a view back into the past, but also an insight into the ideological rhetoric that artists such as Webber were using to be able to cast Cook in multiple roles in the unfolding imperial dramas.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Now I'm wondering, can we bring... There's Katrina. Great.
Hey,
Welcome, Katrina.
hello, and so delighted to be here with and on this panel, because not only have I got you four fabulous people, but all the art that sits behind you. So just fantastic, and thanks in the first instance. I might move between you in particular ways, but I wanted to start with you, Ali and Fiona, because there was this lovely thing that you brought up in relationship to Sandra Saunders about this notion of endlessly rehashing the same history. And I think this came out from Greg and Rachel, you two as well, that we get the same story over and over again. And I was wondering, when you spoke about the way in which Sandra Saunders uses things from second-hand places and things like that, how much of the form of the stuff that you chose informed what you chose? Like, was it when I know that you're restricted, as I understand it, to the Flinders collection, but were you looking for this mixture of textuality and materiality as well as artists?
I'll jump in. Thanks. Can you hear me there? Yeah, I'll just jump in there. Yes. So that particular work was loaned from the artist. So we did bring in a few loans, and absolutely, I think in terms of hanging the show and thinking about the show, we wanted to ensure that it was varied in the representation of the work and the creation of the work to give it texture. But I think also so much is embedded in the materials used by many of the artists that we've shown, and we wanted to be able to bring that to the fore, of course, as well.
Yeah. And was there, Rachel and Greg, especially in that last description that you gave, Greg, of how you've been tracking the images of Weber, you've actually, I think this is more your art historian eye perhaps than your curatorial, but by bringing them together, it's curated it. You've made it look like this fabulous cartoon where the man Cook is giving the medal, then appears as if he's taken that medal and in the second one is stabbing Cook to death with it. Now it's genius of a particular kind. Is this part of how you'd approach curatorship, to take works and make them do something very different?
Look, this is, first of all, I should say that I've been working on this project with Tom Nicholson from Melbourne, and it started off just wanting to do some ground truthing of this mysterious unfinished drawing that sits in the Admiralty Library in Portsmouth, and we'd both independently been over there to see this thing. And having travelled to the place where Cook landed and worked out the position that Weber had been in constructing the scene, we found that there are two massive gum trees that are well over 300 or 400 years old. So there are these two witnesses to the drama, and we kind of tried to fold time in to make some sense of that image for today. But then I started looking at the death of Cook, and I noticed this strange lunging, awkward stance, and we could never work out why the drawing from Bruny Island was never finished. And so we came up with the idea that maybe it ended up being a study for a much more, if you like, worthy grand history painting that Weber ended up focusing his efforts on. So all of this is in the service of Cook's celebrity, and for those of you who have followed the trajectory of the drama of the death of Cook, you'll be aware that it was the subject of paintings by by a large number of artists, and I think there was an exhibition at the Royal Academy which included no less than 4 paintings of the same scene. And it's interesting, in each of those scenes, Cook is cast in a slightly different role. So this is another dimension of the kind of the theme of our show. Too many Cooks. Cook is the hero. He's the great Enlightenment figure. He's a victim. He can be recast depending on just how the Empire wants to nuance the narrative. So putting them together like that does kind of bring it all to life.
And just flipping back to you, Ali, and Fiona, when you were actually, and by the way, I'm waiting for questions on Slido from everyone else, but when, just back to, and this, I'll put the same question to all 4 of you. In the actual invention of the space that you're making, you're curating this thing, around this, this movable figure called Cook. How much thinking, I guess it's went into that. For example, in yours, Fiona, and Ali, the way in which you've got the Julie Gough at the back, as if we're kind of going from the the Namatajira, the double cookiness, to that sort of splintering, powerful piece of Gough. So what's going on there? Was there a particular theatre in your minds as to how you're arranging the art, I guess, is my question.
I can, because we're at Flinders and because we've, focused a lot on non-Indigenous explorers over the years, so there was some kind of sense of this idea of looking back, and this idea of sailing and past pieces of coastline, how we travel across landscape, and also how those ideas of kind of ongoing narratives that are complete, that are somehow all sitting there waiting to be accessed is problematic. So I guess the exhibition at FUMA is really making a complex kind of conversation between these incredible superstars of Aboriginal art that we are so lucky to have in the collection, but also non-Indigenous artists who are engaged in that conversation as well. And I guess the academy of that, Katrina. So we can talk about what does it mean to look and look back, or how we understand our consciousness in relation to those narratives. And I think they're really important. Every time I go in there, I see something else, some relationality.
I think also, the space is quite small. I mean, it's not a huge space, so the works hang quite close together. So they do talk to each other in that way. And on one level, everywhere you turn, there is another Cook in a different kind of guise. But then when you look beyond Cook, then I suppose the other works that we've included there are speaking to Cook's legacy and the legacy of colonialism. So you've got the Cook, who's very much in your face, but then you have the narrative stitched in between that, and I think that's represented in the hang as well.
Yeah, beautifully done. And Rachel, what would you say to the theatre that you created at the Plimsoll Gallery?
Well, I think originally we started with a very small idea for an exhibition with a few pieces, and then when the virus hit and we were given the big gallery, and then we were able to extend, what have we got in the fine art collection that can work here? So we had to really make all of the artwork. There were things that were not immediately apparent that were going to work in this exhibition. I looked at Flinders and I thought, they've got so many pictures of Cook and we don't, and I didn't know how we were going to really. But I think it made us work harder, and it made the art work harder, and I think that was what was really very fulfilling in the end, is that by putting the work up and moving it around the gallery and starting to have things work next to each other, a narrative really emerged. around Cook and others of his ilk. So many cooks, many explorers, scientists, politicians, military people. Those themes started to come out once we worked out how it was going to work as a narrative around a very large space.
Katrina,
Yeah.
I should also add that you were asking about the curatorial dimensions of that that comparison between the drawing and the engraving of the death of Cook. That didn't just happen in art history space. We had a dedicated room in the exhibition, a dark room with a large projection, wall-sized projection at each end of the drawing and of the engraving. And then on either side, the Weber sketch of the Aboriginal man that appears uncannily in both those compositions, and Weber's portrait of Cook that was made just before the third voyage that also appears in both images. And then in the middle of the gallery was Tom Nicholson's sculptural piece, which includes folded takeaway copies of all of this. So that when people wandered into the gallery, they kind of found themselves in this weird art history space that they could recompose themselves.
Yeah, and hopefully it will continue and will be allowed in there sooner rather than later too, you know. And now between the four of you, what would you like to say about the way in which both of your exhibitions speak to each other?
Well, I think that's a good question. Rachel, I liked your point that you just made, that you looked at ours and realised how many cooks there were hanging in the room. I have to say, I got a little bit surprised myself when I started digging in our own collection and discovered how many cooks there were. And I think, you know, that's in a way a legacy to Professor Vincent McGaw, who's in the room with us today, who has been very active in acquiring and donating works to Flinders, and has always seen them as, you know, as teaching tools, and has very much understood that art and history, Australian art and Australian in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in particular, you know, tells a very different kind of story. Hence the many cooks in our show. But I noticed too that you have many as well, which are also a lovely continuation of that conversation.
Greg and
I
Rachel?
think we don't have quite so many actual literal cooks, but we've put a cook costume on lots of people and things. Like Governor Arthur Phillip is, you know, he's just another cook. He's the alternative cook in Australia's white origin myth. And
John Gould.
yeah, we have John Gould in the show, standing in for the you know, for the role of science in tossing out the Indigenous knowledge and taxonomies and overlaying those with stuff that very easily played into scientific racism and, you know, the famous depiction of Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the missing link. So, and, you know, so that's all Cook. They're all Cook.
Yeah.
I also found there was a bit of a link when I was looking at the Right Here, Right Now series, which came out of Co-Media Adelaide. So I suppose there was a nice little link back to Flinders and South Australia that way too. Making, like I say, making connections about things that are not immediately obvious.
Yeah, beautiful. Now I see Penny's come up, and I think she might be trying to still us. Is that correct?
Hello, Katrina. Look, thank you to everybody. We're just running a little bit over time, so I'm going to have to wind up. But I think what you've seen here is there's certainly a cacophony of cooks, and I encourage people online to go online to these two very interesting exhibitions. We've really had just a sneak preview of the exhibitions. There's so much more to see, and we'll be discussing in detail Tall Ships, the video installation by Ali Baker and Unbound Collective later. So we'll go into more depth on that particular piece. But I want to thank our guests, Greg Lehman, Rachel Rose, Katrina Schlunker, better late than never. Thank you. And we'll see Katrina a bit later when she does a wrap-up reflection for us on the day. And thanks, of course, to Ali Gamilla Baker and Fiona Salmon. and we'll see you very shortly as we go into our next session.
Thank you.